We've got two guest speakers today, which are really incredible speakers in terms of areas that are fascinating at the moment. So certainly in terms of innovation, and then looking at entrepreneurial resourcefulness and entrepreneurship. And I think innovation and entrepreneurship also go really nicely hand in hand. But I want to do something a little bit different today. So we're going to start off with our industry expert, which is Alex Fenn, and he's going to be chatting to us today. But before we start, I decided to do something a little bit different. So Alex is an absolute, he's a maverick in terms of being a mechanical engineer who also does innovation and technology. Probably one of the most incredible combinations, as we know, technology and innovation make certainly for agility. And he heads Sibanye-Stillwater's in terms of their continuous innovation strategy. So he really is an innovative person when it comes to the mining sector. But what I find fascinating is his areas of interest include things like organizational innovation, research and development, and technology incubation. Now, we do a lot of business hub innovations, entrepreneurial innovations, and the technology and innovation hubs are always fascinating. So Alex is going to speak to us about an innovative ecosystem and the need for corporate incubation and venturing into South Africa. So what I would like to ask is, I know you ask questions at the end, but I would like to shift it around a little bit and ask people, what do you hope to get out of Alex's talk in terms of, if you want to debate a topic, what would you like him to cover when it comes to this specific topic? Why did you join today? What are your interests in this specific area, etc.? Alex, for us at Da Vinci, the ecosystemic perspective is really critical, because for us, when we work with students and we co-create with students, we say that the world is, you've got to look at things ecosystemically. So we look at things from the micro, the meso, the exo and the macro environment. So basically how the holism of the individual, as well as the external factors, global factors, etc., impact individuals. So for us, looking at things ecosystemically is also about viewing the world through multiple lenses and not just one. So I'm interested to understand innovation in this way, because I think too many people speak about innovation as the development of a product. And it isn't that. It's so much more than that. So I'm just interested to hear how, you view innovation in terms of your definition of innovation and what you think constitutes innovation. Because I think too many definitions of innovation are just so focused on product development, whereas we look at things like innovative processes, systemic thinking, all of those kind of things. So that's just from my perspective that I'm interested in. Anyone else?
Alex, I think when I look at your topic, I want to understand innovation is one thing, but how do you manage innovation? How do you really unlock the value of that? Are there any lessons that you can share with us in accelerating the digital transformation in terms of innovation? Because just having innovation is not helping at all. It's what you do. How do you unlock it? Is there lessons? So I'm very curious about that.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to know, from the concept or an idea, an innovative idea, through to the final delivery, whether it be a system, a process, a product, whatever it is, it's very expensive just to sort of try and make or design, develop and implement something, unless you're really, really sure that that innovative idea is going to be successful. Are there any guidelines, or is it gut feel, or is it something, how do you build on your knowledge to know when an innovative idea is really going to make a difference at the end of the day in your process or your product or your system, in whichever system within your organization? Thank you.
So before I go to Dr. Sigamoni, Alex, just one thing. At Da Vinci, we speak about probing problems. So for us, there's no right or wrong answer. It is just about an interest and a discussion, etc. So if there's any you can't or want to throw back at us, please feel free to be cooperative and co-create. I think we're all just really excited about your topic, because finding someone who is, in terms of innovation and technology, it's difficult to find people that really shift the sector. And I think you've really done some incredible things. So I think it's really exciting. Dr. Sigamoni, I saw your hand was up, Claudia.
Yes, thank you so much. This is such an interesting topic. So I would like to know, yes, we talk about innovation and starting up and from the idea creation to the idea generation, etc. But if we are looking at a business incubator, how supportive can a business incubator be in terms of starting up an organization, in terms of the different focuses or the different disciplines that we have in an organization or in a business for that matter? And at what level would you say that you need to remove that portfolio out of an incubator, or can you actually do that? And also the other interest for me is in terms of an I-lead innovative technology, what would be the financially viable environment there? Because we're looking at incubators at an early phase, at a mid phase, at a post or pre or post phase. But at somewhere along the line, there must be some maintaining of this incubator. So what would an incubator actually perform? What would it actually do? And how would you then define the term business innovation in terms of an an incubator? I think for me, that is such an interest at the moment. Thank you so much.
To have someone who's a technological innovator, if I can make up that word, and is focused on things like incubation and specifically in a really tough sector of mining. But he's actually also a mechanical engineer by trade. So transdisciplinary from a Da Vinci Mode 2 perspective, he has in spades. And he is here to speak to us today in terms of the topic being an innovative ecosystem, the need for corporate incubation and venturing in South Africa. Alex, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doc. And I think very liberal use of the terms there. I've never really considered myself a maverick, so thank you. And happy to lead the first and very challenging format for this discussion. I have written these questions down. I'll try and address as many of them as possible, but I think we do cover the content, and I'm going to share a couple of slides just to support the discussion today. Innovation, ecosystems, the need for corporate venturing, and this is not at all an academic study, so a caveat to this presentation, it's just our observations in terms of how we've tried to participate in a certain space, recognize the constraints in that area, and then try to remediate them through a solution we've implemented recently. But I think to set the context and maybe to answer some of the questions that came up in the beginning, in 2020, we as a business took a position as a digital first organization, and that for us doesn't necessarily mean it's about technology. We are a 85,000 plus people strong business. Our most important asset, if we can refer to it that, and I think it's improper to call people an asset, but is our people. So what we want to try and do is harness the collective intelligence of the business so that we can accelerate that innovation, create inclusive spaces for people to participate. But in essence, talking to that, it's not an organization that adopts innovation and technology only. It creates the structures, cultures, and processes that support digital transformation and looks to technology or digital solutions to realize an opportunity or solve problems. So I think the two differentiating things within that space are, it's not at all about the technology, really. It's about people and managing that innovation appropriately, and then looking to technology and digital solutions to solve problems, and emphasis on problems, because I think it talks to the question around the concept of an idea. If you are solving for a problem, I would want to say irrespective of the cost, likelihood is the investment is definitely going to be worth the payback if you understand what the problem is first. I think very key to reposition one's thinking when considering innovation. We want to solve problems. Technology might be that solution, but it's not always the case. It might be an updated process. Very small change, which we also consider innovation, and just referring back to that question around our definition, we've actually called our innovation process the continuous innovation process, which includes the concept of continuous improvement as well as innovation, because we don't want to differentiate between the two. We don't think it's fair to invalidate what is considered a small improvement against something like artificial intelligence or blockchain, because from our perspective, every innovation, no matter how small, adds value to the business. And that's the messaging we'd like to drive throughout the organization, so that everyone is recognized to the same extent, irrespective of what that innovation actually consists of. But talking, I think, to the reasons why we focus predominantly on culture, structure, and processes is because we understand that successful innovation synthesis requires diversity of thought more than anything else. If you have a lot of people discussing a problem, the likelihood is you're going to get to a solution that is a lot better for the problem, but also probably a lot quicker. And then lastly, all of those people have co-created a solution, they're more likely to adopt it. So that's good for scaled adoption in the long term. The second thing we consider in terms of structure is making sure that people are accountable for their own innovation. If we are going to hold you or make you responsible for that, you need to be accountable for it as well, which means it needs to be embedded in the line functions in the business. We previously ran our technology and innovation function as a concurrent exercise to our normal organizational activities, and that had no impact whatsoever. It was an enormous failure, and I am to blame for that. Happy to take that one on the chin. We don't by test and failure, but in essence, we want to embed it as a core process within our organization so that people will operate, innovate at the same time. And then lastly, process. Because we are so broad, it's a multinational business that covers a broad range of commodities in various jurisdictions. We need to make sure that the process is transparent, number one, but also rigorously structured so that we actually embed the value of the initiative in the bottom line. It doesn't make sense to implement and assume that you've solved the problem. We need to see those benefits flow through to either the shareholder or the broader stakeholder group at large, and that could be in the form of cost benefits or revenue benefits, but also in terms of safety, which we prioritize above all else in the organization that we work for. But in essence, this is how we view innovation. It's not actually about the innovation, it's about people, because people all have good ideas. I've yet to meet someone that doesn't have a good idea, even if they think they don't have a good idea, and we want to harness that intelligence. So we develop what we refer to as the continuous innovation process, and we partnered it with what we consider to be our external ecosystem of service providers, which is continuously evolving. And this is, I guess, the end state that we designed a couple of years ago. But if I look at the process and at the top in particular, this is what we run internally, and it consists of idea management and innovation management. On the left-hand side talks to the culture and the structure side of things. We want to hear from the business their ideas so that we can filter them into priority opportunities that we then structure as projects and then move them into the innovation management space, which invariably ends up at the concept of sustained value. Not everything is going to get there. There are obviously failures, but we believe that by putting a structured process in place that deals with the idea first and the innovation implementation second, that we do, we intend to yield a lot of value, but we are seeing a lot of value through that process at the moment. But that also then serves to inform a broader research and development agenda that we run externally on the organization and caters for everything from fundamental research to what we intend to do in the future, which is commercialization. We'll discuss that a bit in the beginning, but we are well covered in terms of fundamental and applied research through partnerships that we have with universities like WITS, where we fund the Digimine, which is a very interesting center for postgraduate research, which is functioning incredibly well. And we also are partnered with the Mandela Mining Precinct, which is a public-private partnership that focuses on applied research in the mining space. So we have good coverage over here. And then in and around maybe 2018, we wanted to participate more in the startup environment in South Africa in particular. And we took a lot of opportunities, we put them into play, and we realized that we can't actually function effectively in that space. So if we look at this place in particular, as a business, we struggled to adopt innovations that were coming out of small businesses in South Africa, and we couldn't necessarily understand why that was the case, but we saw that as a critical component of being able to support our organization on its internal innovation initiatives. Obviously, everything that comes out of fundamental research in the applied research space is incredibly important, but we need commercial products to adopt. Our business is not that of developing technology, it's adopting it to the extent that we can optimize our core business, which is mining and metallurgy at the moment. And that was very concerning. And we couldn't, for the life of ourselves, I guess, understand why it was that we couldn't find everything that we wanted to find in the space that we wanted to find it. So we did a bit of research and we looked at, the problems that we were experiencing, the challenges we were facing. We tried to understand what was going on, because it is a space that we want to participate in, one of immediate and very significant value. And we came up with a perspective, again, not at all academic, it's very sort of superficial research, but I think it is a good indication of why we struggle in South Africa as an organization to participate in early stage organizations, or rather contract with or enter into commercial relationships with small companies. And I think it starts off with how we as an organization, or rather as an industry, are regulated. So the mining industry has the Mining Charter 3, which is a set of regulations that prescribe what we are to do in certain instances, and deals with everything from safety through to procurement. And one of those regulations is the need to spend 70% of our total R&D expenditure within country. Obviously, our global businesses don't have this constraint, but we do. The majority of our operations sit within South Africa, so it is a substantial component of our research and development effort. But in essence, every R&D, if we have 10 Rand, we have to spend 7 in South Africa according to Mining Charter 3. So if we take again the concept of let's say 10 Rand, and we want to do 10 initiatives, for every 7 Rand we spend in SA, 3 we get to spend globally, and that's, as it stands, okay. It's not too bad. But then what we observed was the bulk of our R&D expense actually goes towards human resources. So a lot of people applying their minds to the problems that we want them to solve. So we've taken this as a proxy for the cost of that research, the average salary per country. And as you can see in South Africa, it's a lot lower than 5 competitor countries. So I only selected those on the basis of available data. But you can see United States, Switzerland, Germany, Israel, and the United Kingdom a lot more expensive in essence to innovate within. And then that little sort of graph on the right, not graph, rather table, this is where these companies are positioned in terms of the technological expertise ranking, which is a metric that the World Economic Forum comes up with. But in essence, yeah, so they're all relatively highly placed in the top 10, and we're at 68. And I'll talk to that a bit more. But moving back to the average salary thing, if we do apply that multiple, in essence, it makes the R&D in South Africa cheaper, which means we have to do more of it in order to comply with our Charter 3 requirements. So the effective ratio of local to international initiatives, if we take that 10 Rand and spend it on 10 different projects, is actually 23 to 1. So the actual multiple of initiatives that we need to pursue in SA versus external globally competitive technology is 7 to 1. So above 87%, I think that's 87.5%, of our initiatives have to be done. If we go on a volume basis as opposed to a value basis, we have to do them in South Africa. And that's also okay. I think a lot of interesting stuff coming on in South Africa at the moment. But really, if we then sort of assess the landscape in terms of our nation's ability to compete from an R&D perspective, it gets more complicated. So here we're looking at some stats around population and the levels of education versus their R&D expenditure within country. So on the left is just a map, but let's focus on the graph on the right-hand side. You can see across the board in the top sort of countries that we're comparing ourselves to today, we have tertiary education percentages of between 29 and 51%, so very high compared to our 7% educated at that level. You can see the numbers are extensive for the larger populations. But if we consider that in the context of those nations' annual R&D expenditure, are somewhat similar, so maybe a multiple or 2 more than what we spend on our base. The companies have a broader population to tap in terms of research, development, and technology. They're also spending a lot more on a per capita basis than we are, and that's resulted us in us being sort of very lowly rated in that index at number 68. So again, Charter 3 asks of us to spend as much as we can in SA, and we appreciate the logic behind that. We support the concept of transformation, but given the environment, it's very difficult to find the people to actually use that funding effectively, develop the solutions that we need in country, and then solve the problems that we need to solve. I think also if we look at these R&D expenditures over time, South Africa has been historically depressed and continues to be depressed in comparison to other countries, which means we don't have that intellectual property base off which to launch. A lot of these companies have been spending this money for 30, 40, 50 years. We've been spending very little for a very long time, which means that we don't necessarily have a historical IP base on which to launch some new innovation, which makes it equally complex as well. I think then the last thing that we picked up as well recently is the availability of venture capital. And this again is as a proxy, an indication of why it might be constrained, not necessarily the answer here, just our perspective. But venture capital generally being the largest source of funds tapped to scale small businesses to a level that makes them appropriate for relationships with ourselves. So very often small businesses have great innovations, great prototypes, but we just can't contract with them because they're not large enough. It's very hard to establish them on our vendor systems. It's very hard to transact with them responsibly. We don't necessarily know where that's going, and there's very limited legal recourse in the event that some of these relationships fail, which makes it hard for us to assume that responsibility as well as that capital risk when engaging with small companies. So generally, I mean, across the board, venture capital being the early entry into some of these businesses, helping them scale their prototypes to a point at which large corporates such as ourselves would adopt that technology at scale without any consideration of the risk, because we know who to turn to if everything goes wrong. Whereas prior to that state, we don't necessarily have the recourse. But again, looking at venture capital availability within South Africa, compared to the other nations we have been discussing, consistently low. So it's at 2.87 in 2017 versus the United States 5.24. So the index on the left is on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being incredibly difficult to obtain this kind of capital and 7 being very easy. And as you can see, there's also a drop-off after the economic crisis in 2008, after which the bulk of these countries actually recovered. We stayed relatively similar. And then if you look at the venture capital availability in terms of our rank in competition with these other nations, we have decreased over time from 64 to number 77. And this is in an index of 141 companies, whereas the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, and Switzerland are still relatively high. So again, not a lot of people to tap in, but then also not a lot of capital to tap into to scale these businesses going forward. So all told, very complex to get an organization who has a novel innovation off the ground before it even has an opportunity to do work with companies like ourselves, which is an additional constraint. So I think in summary, we all agree R&D is fundamental to progress. We have to do it. We need to do it. The world changes absolutely every day, and we need to keep up with those changes to be competitive and sustainable as an organization. But our regulations as a mining company in South Africa are limiting in terms of our exposure to global capacity as well as global technology. And that's going to put us on the back foot if we as a nation want to remain competitive in the mining context. Excuse me, our capacity in country is limited. So if we do comply to those regulations, which we wholly intend to do, we don't necessarily have the places to put this capital in order to develop new innovations, because we are generally depressed, both in terms of intellectual capacity and education levels, as well as sources of funding, as well as historical funding. And we've also identified, which is not necessarily covered in the preceding statistics, that this skills shortage is multifaceted. So it's not only an absence of capability in the sciences, the entrepreneurial acumen required to take something novel and turn it into a viable business is also lacking. So myself as an engineer early on, fantastic with terrible at business. And that's generally the case. And if you are good at business, you might not necessarily be great at engineering. Blanket statement. I know there are exceptions to those rules, but in essence, we have both the absence of scientific knowledge, but also the absence of entrepreneurial skill that would support a new venture in its growth early stages in order to participate in our environment. I'm just going to refer back to the questions. So I think I might have covered most. You can always come back to them, but we as a company, we recognize the constraint, we understand it. And what we're trying to do, just to make a small difference, it's not an enormous effort, but it's not necessarily our whole responsibility to do this, is implement a program that we think will bridge some of the gaps that we've identified. So last year we launched our Ixs Initiative, which is short for Innovate, Accelerate and Scale. And I know Accelerate is spelled with an A, not an X, but IAS just didn't sound as cool. And the objectives of that initiative are threefold. The first is primarily to attract and develop non-core expertise towards our company to solve mining-related issues that people aren't necessarily focused on. So a lot of entrepreneurs want to be in the sexy businesses. We're not necessarily that attractive from that perspective, but we would like those skills to apply their minds to our problems to see if they don't have another answer that we haven't thought of before. And that talks to the concept of an ecosystem, because we can get different skill sets and different capabilities and different perspectives into the business through this mechanism. We're exposed to those skill sets more so than we would have been if we followed our normal structure. The second objective is to progress technology development to prototype and proof of concept level, so scaling up a product to the extent that it proves itself in a representative environment. And then lastly, to develop these businesses to a sustaining level and potentially to an exportable level within the South African context. So we want to get the right people on the problems that we need to solve, number one. We want to give people the opportunity to take those expensive prototypes and prove them in an environment that makes sense to us. And then we want to develop those businesses commercially to the extent that we can transact with them effectively, but they can also transact with other companies, both locally and internationally going forward. And within this initiative, we have two sub-programs. So the incubator specifically is wholly a human capital element. We have entrepreneurs and innovators in there that help focus on some of the issues that we don't necessarily have the capacity to solve, nor would we consider to be core business for us. So sundry issues that are important but not necessarily within our area of expertise, we'd like to channel through that incubator to develop new solutions, but also new business models. And we'd hope between the entrepreneurs and the innovators they'd come up with those solutions for us. But those entrepreneurs and innovators also help support the companies that we invest in from an IXS develop phase, which is the second sub-program of our initiative, which invests in these businesses so that we can prove the technology up to a state that we feel comfortable adopting them at scale. And I think there's a lot to be said around the difference between funding an objective or funding a proof of concept as opposed to investing in a business. For us, we see our commitment as an enabler to business continuity and reliability. So the fact that we have a hand, or we're holding hands with that organization more so than just through commercial transactions, helps support them get to where they need to be, but also helps people understand that we see value in this business and we're committed to that business over and above a standard transactional relationship. But also because we're putting that risk in, we'd like to see that capital grow and then reinvest it into new businesses that we might identify. So we'd like it to be almost an evergreen fund that recirculates that financial return so that we can do this at a much larger scale. But generally, we prioritize the benefit of the entrepreneur over ourselves on the basis that a successful business there means it's a successful business for us. But yeah, so I think it's not enormous. It's in its first year and we're really trying to prove the concept here. But we are going to hopefully bridge a very small component of the gap that I've explained earlier, both in terms of the skill shortage, but also the commitment to small businesses that can't scale to the extent that they can transact with us effectively. And I think that covers the basis. I did want to cover the question around how committed I think corporates can be. If I misinterpret this, please do put your hand up and remind me what you were asking. But how invested we can be in companies in order to grow them, we actually haven't considered that, and we're still testing that, so we don't wholly understand it. I would hate to lie to you on this call, but we really are finding our feet with this initiative now. But what we'd hope to demonstrate is that in an evolving world, there is a lot of space for this type of initiative, and we are definitely committed to seeing these relationships through as far as we can. and until it makes reasonable sense to be there. If you think about the scale of these investments, they are incredibly small compared to the gearing, the benefits of these. So the technology, the benefit of the technology in our business versus the potential returns in terms of that investment compared to our larger organization is negligible, and often comes with, they're big returns, but they're not as big as the returns we generally deal with, which means it's not something we can prioritize. At the point where it becomes unreasonable to be invested in that business, would want to depart, obviously on amicable terms, but so that that business is then free from the constraints. We've done our job, it can move on. It's not our job to own companies, if that makes sense, if they're not related to mining directly. And then the second question, I think, is how do you deal with innovation in the global context? So firstly, on the definition side, Dr. Marla, anything that changes for the benefit of the organization, we consider to be innovative. I don't think it's right to classify innovation to specific initiatives. It's not an academic definition of it, but any improvement for us is considered an innovation. And then I think just in terms of one of the reasons why we've structured this is how do we position our business to be future fit in an evolving global context? You have to take into account your relationship with clients, as well as their clients. Concepts of circular economy are coming through. ESG is a huge driver of value for ourselves as well as the ecosystems in which we operate. So we're having to become a lot more open-minded in terms of our definition of diversity and inclusivity, and not in the general sense where you've got sort of demographic representation and you're inclusive as an organization. We like to consider things such as cognitive diversity. So where can we get different perspectives on things that we don't necessarily understand, that might highlight something that we wouldn't have known prior to, after we got that insight. And this gives us access to some of that capacity, but through these startups as well, a lot of additional capacity. There is a small digital business in Cape Town, and we are considering investing in them as one of our flagship investments. And it is a team full of highly talented and very exceptional human beings with very interesting ideas, but also have a good focus on something that is very relevant to us on a core business perspective. And we value their insights. So we'd like to take their insights into our business, learn from them, and develop new solutions to problems that they might not necessarily be solving. It's also a different skill set in the sense that we're not structured to retain talent that's focused wholly on data science, as an example. For now, we are very conventionally structured, as are most mining companies. You do have your small teams of innovation professionals, but they are limited in terms of what you can do without overinflating your overhead. So we might never get to experience some of the talent that we do see in the startups that we're investing in now. So this is one of the initiatives that we hope will position us to understand both the local and the global context of the technology that they develop for the benefit of our organization. I just want to refer back to, again, our support of a business can be in starting up a business. I think I might have covered all of them unless I haven't, in which case I'm happy to take questions, but that about covers everything I'd like to discuss on slides today.
I love the way that you defined innovation, because like I said at the beginning, I like it that it's anything that changes processes, changes things, etc. Because I've seen organizations and entrepreneurs shift hugely just by making those type of commitments and appreciating them. So to those that asked questions, I hope your questions have been answered, but if they haven't, feel free to come back. Gibson, I know you had a question when we started. Do you want to ask your question now, or has it been answered?
Yeah, my question with innovation, especially in South Africa, actually in the whole world, I know there's a saying that the world economies are promising the people economic development which the planet cannot support continually. So in the interest of our circular economy, what is it that Sibanye has in place to ensure that repurpose things, because our planet is under attack, under stress? Thank you.
That's a great question, and it's something we're grappling with as well. But we have seen some significant shifts in strategy, and I'm probably not the right person to talk about it, but I'll try and do it justice. But we've recently updated our vision as to safeguard global sustainability through the supply of green metals in support of the energy transition. So I think one thing people take for granted is the benefit platinum and palladium provides to the environment at the moment. Huge catalytic enabler, reducing emissions in vehicles, but also will be a very strong component of the hydrogen economy going forward. So while people don't view it necessarily as something that's a green metal, it is actually incredibly green, and in the future will be a lot greener going forward. We've also recently invested in lithium and nickel, which are key to the energy transition on the battery side of things. So we position our strategy from that perspective, and our executive is very committed to delivering on what we say. We don't necessarily want to fluff a market up or anything like that. We actually do what we say we want to do. The other thing we've done recently was segment our recycling business outside of the US operation. So we used to have we still have it, but a platinum and palladium mine in North America. Subcomponent of that business was recycling. We recently segmented it out in order to focus on recycling as a core value stream for our organization, and that's something that we want to drive very strongly into the future to position ourselves to repurpose some of the stuff that we produce now. It's an incredibly difficult market to recycle. You have to recover a lot of this. It results in theft, and we're getting our heads around how to do this ethically in order to make sure that we don't inadvertently cause any kind of harm through the recycling process. And once you've got that down, we'll definitely drive the numbers in those businesses up as much as possible. But it is a strong focus. So it's a strategic differentiator for us to segment that business out of our current infrastructure to prioritize recycling as a core value stream for our organization going forward. And that's again in support of our recently revised vision, which is to safeguard global sustainability through the delivery of green energy metals, or green metals in support of the energy transition. So very early days, but I think what we've recognized and the way in which our business has grown is in support of the energy transition to an extent. We are a gold mining company, but we're a very big platinum group metals mining company, which will be pivotal in that transition, and we're moving more into the battery metal space to ensure that we cover as much as possible from a production perspective. We also drive key ESG metrics within the business. We've got a very well-structured decarbonization framework. We target carbon neutrality by 2040 and carbon zero by 2050, if I'm not mistaken. And again, someone who's probably better at explaining that than I am. But we are trying to be as environmentally efficient as an organization in support of that initiative. So we would like the metals that we supply in order to support the energy transition to they themselves be as energy independent or environmentally friendly as possible prior to procurement by clients of ours.
I think that's a very comprehensive answer, and it's actually quite fascinating. I didn't realize the amount of sort of resources and effort you're putting into that, which is really incredible, because I do think too often organizations that deplete the environment don't really look at sustainable green strategies. And if you look at some of the current trends in business schools internationally, it's actually to include green economics, green business, etc., into curricula to teach strategists to have responsible plans, etc., towards environmental factors, etc. So Dr. Lloyd has asked, how does your company manage the issue of intellectual property of an innovation that belongs to an external person?
It's a tough one. And historically, we've never been in the business of IP, so we don't intend to claim it. Again, the gearing on these initiatives is substantial. Small incremental improvements result in hundreds of millions of rands worth of things. We don't necessarily see the benefit in the upside of technology, nor do we want to restrain it from a market where it could be deployed. The incubator, the way in which we're structured at the moment, the intention is to be invested in the holdings, so we'd have exposure to that IP, but never a controlling interest in that organization. If we got there, we failed. We're only invested in order to support these businesses in their early stage and middle stage growth, but not in essence to retain any control over that IP. So we don't necessarily want to own it. I think we did a patent study the other day for the company. We actually only hold a very small amount of patents through products that we've developed internally only. So we don't necessarily want to retain the rights to IP generated outside of the business, and that's definitely not the intention. So it's something I think we'll learn, but really from a sentiment perspective, it doesn't make sense to us to own that IP if we're not going to do anything with it. And it's also doesn't make sense to us to own it on the basis that we aren't going to do anything with it. We'd rather rely on the companies that we want to develop to use that IP effectively on our behalf and for the benefit of everybody else as well.
Thanks for that. Shirley, I hope that answers your question. And then Brian has asked, what is the typical RAND value of incubator investment in pressed and seed capital? In pre-seed and seed capital, sorry. And Dr. Lloyd says thank you as well. So her second question was, is there an innovative strategy to develop more in-country beneficiation of raw materials?
So quickly on the typical RAND values, so our pre-seed values are up to 2 million, our seed values are up to 6 million Rand per investment. But those are subject to change based on what is required. Sometimes you find relatively small change processes require a lot of capital equipment. It's not unheard of for us to see things cost upwards of 15 million Rand, 20, 40, 50, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. And if there's a business case, we'd revise that in order to support it. But the guideline to which we work is pre-seed capital to 2 million, seed capital up to 6. And we're working on a subsequent program called Scale, which will deal with the much larger investments at a later stage as well. The innovative strategy to develop more in-country beneficiation of raw materials is a tough one. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think the constraint we as a country have is not an innovation problem. We have a very, very difficult investment climate. I don't know if that's fair to say, but it's hard to attract investor capital. There's a lot of junior projects coming online or would like to come online that just lack investment. We are very heavily endowed from a resource perspective, both in South Africa as well as Southern Africa, but we just struggle to get the representative levels of capital in to develop those commodity bases to the extent that they need to be developed. So the problem we have in SA is not a volume of resource, it's a volume of reserve. So once you convert what is feasible for extraction, and that obviously requires capital in very large numbers, which we don't necessarily attract as well as we should. So I think if there was any innovation to help secure, say, external investment or general investment in some of the junior miners that are developing projects in country, that would probably be the best way to do more in-country beneficiation of raw materials. Actually, sorry, I spoke to extraction. Beneficiation, let me think about that. Probably the same problem, though.
Gibson says, in the interest of bridging the gap between policy and practice, realizing that business schools the world over are in support of circular economy, how do you think your strategy could be linked with social labor plan and basic education system?
That's deep.
That's very deep, Gibson.
So we have considered what this means in terms of education. We're not necessarily NQF qualified though in terms of the incubator, so we can't link that as of yet. But I do think what we would intend to do is try and create a space in which we can educate people who are innovative to participate in the landscape a little bit more effectively. From a social labor plan perspective, a lot of what we're focused on at the moment from a development fund perspective is sundry, adjacent and circular economy. An example of that is where we do a lot of water treatment. Some of our operations pump in excess of, say, 250 million litres of water per day, which we have to treat. But through that treatment, there's actually a lot of opportunities for offtake of other commodities, fertilizer being one of them. Previously, we were only not only concerned. We prioritize the treatment of that water to potable standards for the benefit of the environment. But in actual fact, you can facilitate sundry revenue streams on the back of what comes out of that water treatment process, which we're working on now. So it wouldn't have been core business for us, but in essence, we've partnered with a company to whom this is core business, so that jointly we can grow both the optimization of our water treatment, but also a secondary economy within the regions in which we operate. And the intent is to try and create legacy economies around the operations that will invariably close, mining being terminal to an extent. And you can't run these things forever. There's only so much commodity in the ground. We want to try and do as much as we can now to establish secondary industries, but we haven't necessarily considered it to the extent that I think you're asking, Gibson. It is on the radar though, and I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Thanks for that. So one of our lecturers says that if she were to mark this as an assessment, she would give you comprehensively discussed. Thank you for that. So,
is that out of 10?
Yeah, and so he wants to know how many out of 10. Petunia, I'll let you have the last question. Petunia, do you want to ask your question and then we will move on to Letta?
Okay, so from one of the presentation slides on the IXS, I read something briefly on the dedicated internship programs. So I'm curious to understand, are these engineering graduates? Do you actively go out to institutions of higher learning to source or get the graduates? And how do you communicate these initiatives, and then after the internship, are the graduates absorbed into the company? And then you also mentioned skills and innovation capacity. I'm curious to understand if there has or you have been, if you have or there has been a plan to partner with strategic departments and institutes of higher learning to at least intervene in that skills gap and to contribute to upskilling, develop fit for purpose graduates and programs. Thank you.
So I think to your first question, it's still early stages, and we've been, given the scale of the incubator at the moment, we've taken a more targeted approach to the entrepreneurs in particular. Generally, we've got partner business schools with which we work, as well as the partner who's helping facilitate that incubator. It's mostly the South African schools, and we're targeting near MBA grads. Generally, their undergrad is not necessarily of relevance to us. So in the current fold, we've got someone who did radiography, we've got an electrical engineer, we've got a project management professional, and we've got a nuclear engineer. Engineering not being it's obviously heavily represented, but it's not a priority for us. So we want a diverse set of skills. On the entrepreneur side, they need to be either just about to or have had achieved their MBA. So we do want high quality people, and we approach the business schools for that intake. On the innovator side, it's quite strange. It's an avenue to try and attract someone who hasn't yet gotten to a stage where you need to seed that capital. So one of our innovators is hugely qualified, but his technology was at a stage where we needed to bridge the gap, in which case we brought him in to develop his concept further. And that was somehow autonomous. But for the second innovator, we're going to go out on call now to try and attract new people around a specific problem that we'd like to solve. And it's heavily focused on the energy transition, how we as a business can accelerate our decarbonization objectives. But in future, I think what we would want to do is formalize that process a lot more, engage with the various institutions in country, try and put those calls out a lot earlier so we can attract the skills at a stage, but we do require a certain level of experience in there as well. If we can't get it, that's fine, but it's generally post-grad that we're trying to attract in both of those internships. On the second side, the skills gap. So we as a company fund UJ and WITS specifically. UJ has used that to upgrade the way in which they train people. So they've tried to revolutionize their facilities in support of mining undergrads, so that they get exposure to new technologies and they can hopefully take them with them into business as they start on their learnerships early on. So they've got a very interesting facility at their campus in Johannesburg. And then WITS uses their funding to do postgraduate research on the applications of digital technology, specifically in safety, but we're also moving towards ESG and productivity now as well. And that also turns out quite a lot of interesting people with very, very interesting skills and quite unique. We often lose them to the consultancies because of the caliber and the uniqueness of the skill. In terms, so going back to your original question, internalizing these resources in the long term, an objective would be to put these people in a position where they can run a successful business. So we haven't necessarily made space for them internally to do it as of yet, but it is on the radar to figure out how we retain some of that talent if we'd like to in the long term. In most cases, a lot of people are doing it for the experience as well. And it's good experience as a stepping stone, but I think in the long term we'd want to internalize this. But given the fact that we're not wholly confident in the model yet, we're still testing it, we haven't capacitated for a successful model as of yet. But once we have a good understanding of what the longer term vision will be for this incubator and development fund, we'll apply a lot more thinking as to how we capacitate it on the fringes.
Thanks so much for that, Alex. So I'd like to get Letta. Petunia said thanks for your response. I'd like to get Letta to share her screen to see what she could make out of the discussion.
100%. Thank you, Mala. I have shared my screen. You can see the visual summary in front of you. Let me give you a very quick overview. Alex spoke to us about an innovative ecosystem, the need for corporate incubation and venturing in South Africa. And some of the questions that you asked was, what is innovation? What is it really? How do you unlock it? How do you maintain it? Because it is quite expensive. He shared with us that innovation is really around harnessing the intelligence through three processes: the culture, the structure, and the process in the organization. But then finally it comes down to people. It's about solving a problem through diversity of thought. It adds to the bottom line because it's about the commercial argument. He also spoke to us about the structured process, the idea management on one side and the innovation management on the other side, but also the specific problems that they found specifically around finding good people with high levels of education. The Charter 3 requirement says that they have to spend 70% of R&D in South Africa. The level of education is low, the venture capital is scarce, and we have to remain competitive as a country. So the outcome there is R&D is critical. The regulations limit us. We have limited capacity to innovate, and the multifaceted skill shortage is not making things any easier. I thought it was really interesting to see the approach around innovate, accelerate, and scale. Three things there to highlight: attract the expertise, get to a prototype, and then develop the commercial application. And Alex spoke to us about incubate and develop. It's about finding the right partner and then growing together. He also spoke about the fact that they are committed to protecting the planet through repurpose and recycle. IP is not the focus. It's really around building those businesses in order to leave legacy economies. So that's where we are in the visual summary. Mala, back over to you.
Alex, I hope you liked the summary of your discussion.
11 out of 10. I've only got 10 fingers left.